Hi, welcome to part three of the films that made me a sort of nostalgic look back at the sort of landmarks in my appreciation of film. And today we're now in my 20s and I've found the BFI, I've discovered cinema in London, and I'm going crazy watching every film I can get my hands on. And what I want to do in this episode is just look at the films that were really instrumental in me understanding film and appreciating film further. Really important films in my 20s that have stayed with me. The first one I want to talk about is this film, A Matter of Life and Death. This was about the fifth or sixth film I saw at the BFI, and it blew my head off because, for the simple reason, I had no idea that British cinema had produced a film like this. It had the confidence and the brio and the dynamism of Hollywood, but it was completely and utterly English. Idiosyncratic, fantastical, whimsical, funny, totally confident in what it was doing. I was amazed by it. The bravura of it, the special effects sequences, the brilliant representation of Hollywood. You know, that fantastic opening where it goes through the whole of space and then goes down into Earth, and a plane is on fire. I mean, I just didn't realise that British cinema was like this. For me, up until the age of about 22, British cinema seemed so pedestrian and boring and realistic. And there was this. Wow. And it made me realise that there was so much more possibilities to film than I'd realised. Then I saw this film. And this became one of the most important films of my life. It wasn't just because it was a horror film and I was a big horror fan, and has always been regarded as one of the classics of horror. It was something else. And I'll try and put it this way. Carl Dreyer said in an interview about this film, what he tried to do was this. Let's say you go into a normal living room. Chairs, table, bookcase, whatever. And then someone tells you that behind the sofa there's a dead body. Suddenly, the whole room changes, even though visually nothing has changed. You can't see the body, but your whole impression of the room changes. Suddenly it becomes uncanny. To me, that comment that Dreyer made about this film is the heart of cinema. How do you use image, sound, just physical, real qualities in front of a camera to make the audience feel, to make the audience believe? This whole film, it's not, to call it a horror film undermines it really, because it doesn't behave like other horror films. It's not interested in narrative, it's not interested in character. What it does, it's really simply a series of tableaux of images to provoke the sense of the uncanny. It's a poem of the uncanny. And when I first saw it, it bamboozled me. I thought, what is this? But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I realised that this film for me became a sort of one of the avatars of what I thought cinema was about. The use of image in this film is extraordinary. The whole film is shot through this kind of gauzy white filter. So it's like some wag said, it's not film noir, it's film blanc, which I thought was quite clever. The whole film is just designed to make you feel uncomfortable. So it has characters coming forward and going behind the camera, then coming round the camera. It disorientates your sense of space, of time, of left and right, up and down. And there's a shot in the film, for example, a very simple shot. This woman has been bitten by a vampire, and the servants of the house get her back into the house. And then you see them bring her down the corridor and up the stairs. That's it. Right? It's not a big set piece sequence. It is one of the most fascinating shots in cinema. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about that shot. Dreyer films it in the most peculiar way. We know that the servants are out here, right? He starts his camera inside the house. The front door is there. He starts it back there and then pulls back the camera. Then the servants come in the door. They're dragging her down. You're pulling back down the corridor. And then you come through a door and you see two main characters are actually watching that you didn't know were there. That's it. I guarantee if you watch it and you're a student of film or interested in film, it's beautiful and it's so weird. It's so uncanny, right? Even just a simple shot like that. There's no other film quite like this. I can't tell you this was a film, I've watched it again and again and again as a model of what cinema can do. Then I saw this movie, Close Up. This is by Kiarostami. The reason why this film is so important to me is for two reasons. First of all, it gave me a kind of cinema that I don't think anyone could have expected. It was based on a real incident that happened in Tehran, in Iran, where a young working class guy impersonated a major filmmaker called Mohsen Makhmalbaf, who really exists. And this upper class family were taken in by it and invited him into their home. Then they found out he was an imposter and they shopped him to the police. And Kiarostami found out about this. And he asked the authorities, can I film the trial? Can I actually have a camera team in the trial filming it and asking him questions? And the Iranian authorities said yes. And that makes up the bulk of the film. But then around this, what Kiarostami did was he reenacted this story with the people involved, with the man who'd impersonated Mohsen Makhmalbaf and with the family he deceived, and created kind of a whole new approach to cinema. And also made a film that is one of the most powerful statements about what it is to be an artist, what it is to be creative. Because this guy is not a swindler, he's an artist. And that's one of the things that most, in wanting to be Mohsen Makhmalbaf and in the statements he makes, he becomes creative, he becomes an artist. And that made a deep impression on me. The second reason is because the discovery of Kiarostami was the discovery of a director, an art director and filmmaker, who was a new cinema for my generation. Previous generations had Godard, or they'd had Fassbinder, or whatever, or, whichever name you want to pluck out of the air. Who was the generation of Star Wars and Lucas going to have? It turned out to be a guy from Iran. You could have seen that coming, right? And Kiarostami became our standard bearer. He was the new cinema for our generation, along with Hu Chao-chen in Taiwan. And I became a religious devotee of Kiarostami. Still am, despite the current scandals around his name. I still think he's a major filmmaker. So this was important. It gave my generation a new filmmaker to be interested in. Now I want to talk about two films that taught me a lesson in how to watch movies. First of all, Late Spring, which has gone on to become one of my two favourite films of all time, the other being Audette by Cole Dreyer. I had heard about Ozu, a very famous Japanese filmmaker, and I'd got into Japanese film. I'd been watching Kurosawa and Mizoguchi, etc. And I'd also been watching Takeshi Kitano, which I liked very much. And there was an Ozu season at the BFI, and I persuaded some of my friends we should go and see some Ozu. And the first film I went to see was Brothers and Sisters of the Toda Family. We sat down and watched it. I didn't really know what was coming. And for the first hour or so, I was really bored. I'm ashamed to admit this, but I was. And I thought, what is this? This is just Japanese people being nice to each other, But I couldn't walk out. I was with some friends and I was about 10 deep in the row. So I sat and watched it, and eventually I started to get into it. I started to get into the rhythm and what the director was doing. The next week I went to see Late Spring, and this was one of the most powerful and overwhelming experiences watching a film. I'd learnt how to watch. You have to learn how to appreciate the really great directors and artists. And I'd learnt what Ozu was doing, I knew what to expect, and I was just overwhelmed. What a masterpiece. An incredibly beautiful and moving film. Making the most beautiful art out of the sparest means. Just people talking to each other, just the careful framing and positioning and cranking up of drama through everyday, normal, pared down dramatic elements. I still think that this film is one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen and one of the most moving. It's a very simple story. It's about a young woman, she's living with her father, he's widowed, he's a professor, and everyone's telling him, you need to get her married off. But actually they like being together. And then what happens is, when he tries to marry her off, she feels betrayed. She doesn't understand why he's doing it. And so slowly, this gesture of that the old man thinks he's doing the right thing, it splits him apart, and the love between him and his daughter is compromised. It's so moving, and it's so beautifully made. And the second film which taught me a lesson was Latimont by Jean Vigo. I went to see this very early on in my cinephile time in London, and I didn't really get on with it. It just didn't hit the ground running for me. But later on, I went to see Zéro de Conduite in a double bill with this film with my girlfriend at the time. And we watched Zéro de Conduite, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And I said, come on, let's go. We don't watch Latimont. But she said, oh, come on, we may as well. We've paid for it. So I sat down and I watched it. And it was a masterpiece. I just didn't understand. How could it be so good? How did I miss this first time around? And again, I was taught a lesson, that great works of art and great directors are not immediately intelligible, not immediately accessible. Be more open-minded, be more patient. This movie is so beautiful. It's so wonderfully romantic. All the scenes with Michel Simon are fantastic. If you can, there are various versions of this film. There's a wonderful scene where Michel Simon takes the girl down into his cabin and shows her all his knickknacks and bric-a-brac from over the years. And he puts this cigarette in his belly button, and it's got a little face on his belly button, so it looks like the face is smoking. And the little cats are watching the record player, and they're patting it. It's so wonderful. I don't know why I didn't see this film first time round, but it's an object lesson that great works of art sometimes you need to sit with them and learn them. Now, there are three other movies at this time that I saw that introduced me to three of the most important directors in my life and really determined the way I thought about film. First of all, we have to talk about Journey to Italy by Roberta Rossolini. I don't even know how to talk about this movie, but Rossolini was a huge discovery for me. Here was this director who I think really started modern cinema in the post-war period. And he started this whole idea of using amateur, normal people to act. That had actually been done before, to be fair, in British cinema in the 40s. But he sort of popularised it. He took the camera out on the streets into actual locations. And he was one of the leading lights of neo-realism in Italy. And then he had this very scandalous affair with Ingrid Bergman. And so this neo-realist brought into his films probably the most famous female star of his time, which caused all sorts of problems in Italy and with film critics. I think these three films with Ingrid Bergman are the nucleus of cinema. That I would go that far. I think they're absolutely extraordinary. And understanding why they're so beautiful taught me so much about film. You see, this film, really, is quite dull. It's about a boring English couple, played by Ingrid Bergman and George Sanders, neither of whom were born in England, but anyway. And they're driving down to Italy to sell this house that they've inherited. That's it. They go to Naples, they're quarrelling all the time, they're sort of falling out with each other. Ingrid Bergman goes off and looks around the universities, looks around Vesuvius and all the rest of it. That's it. And it's all done in this dull, monochrome, very realistic fashion. And then at the end, they're quarrelling. And they're on this busy street, there's a festival taking place. And they have a row. And suddenly, she is caught in the crowd. And you see her like this, just for about a split second. It's one of the most powerful shots in film history, but you see it in a blink of an eye. You just see Ingrid Bergman like that, being torn away by the crowd. All it is she's caught up in the festival crowd, but it gets you right there. And suddenly George Sanders, very elegant, urbane George Sanders, finds himself plunging into the crowd after her. They meet, they finally get to each other, they kiss, and they make up. That's it. What it taught me was, I found that ending incredibly moving. I still find it one of the most moving endings. Even talking about it, I'm welling up. What I loved about the film was it taught me that a cinema is not about having fantastic cinematography, having fantastic special effects, having a brilliant soundtrack, all those things that Oscars make out are the attributes of a great film. It's the conception of a film. It's the philosophy of it. It doesn't matter if some of the acting is not so good. It doesn't matter if some scenes are a bit boring or there are longueurs. It doesn't matter. It is the overall experience of it, where it takes you as a person psychologically and emotionally. It's that hunt for truth, right? That's what a film, that's the making of a film. That's why this film is so beautiful. It's hunting for a moment of truth, and it gets it. And everything else is subservient to it. Right? It doesn't have to be this grand, fantastic narrative with great actors doing great actorly things. That's not the point. The point is truth, and that's the only point. And that's what Rossolini taught me, and what this film particularly taught me. The second film that was huge for me was Crease, or Crease, I don't know if I've pronounced it correctly. This is the third of the films that Antonioni made with Monica Vitti in the 1960s. I can honestly say, discovering Antonioni, every single time I watched an Antonioni film, it recalibrated everything I thought about film. I don't think any other director has done that. In the modern age, Albert Serrat is coming close. But this director, Antonioni, I think taught me more about cinema and how to think about cinema, perhaps than any other. And what I realised was, what a lot of people think about Antonioni is boring, not much happens. You know, this is about two lovers who come together, they sort of spend some time together, then they split up. That's it, right? That what is so powerful is how the film shows that visually and sonically. All those years ago when I'd watched Blade Runner, what I'd realised that I loved about Blade Runner was not the story. The story was pretty basic. It was how the story was told, the use of music, the use of lighting, the use of editing, the production design, the way that the actors spoke their lines and related to each other. That was the film. Antonioni is the master of that. His films are not boring at all. In fact, they're incredibly rich. L'Aventure and L'Eclisse, which I think have got to be in the top 10 movies of all time, they're so rich. If you actually look at the detail and how each shot relates to the next, and how each shot relates across the movie to other shots, and there are rhymes, these films are amazingly rich. And the ending of this film, what happens is these two, Alain Delon and Monica Vitti, have decided they don't like each other. Alain Delon and Monica Vitti. Oh well. I mean, it's incredible. But they don't get together. And what they've decided, they're going to meet at their usual place. The camera turns up, they don't. And for about the last 10 minutes of the film, we just have these shots of this place where they're supposed to meet. And it goes gradually from day to night, the lights come on, the cars get less, the people get less, there's this strange foreboding, and the movie just ends. Again, ambiguity, as I spoke about in a previous video. I honestly, every single film by Antonioni, Il Grido, Zabriskie Point, Blow Up, The Passenger, were major stepping stones to my understanding of how film worked. I think this film is incredible. The last film I want to talk about is Stalker by Tarkovsky. Now, Tarkovskyites, like myself, can sometimes get a bit ridiculous about Tarkovsky, okay? You get into hyperbole and, it's almost like Tarkovsky is the Pope of cinema, right? There's something mystical about him. I'm no different. I do feel that way, and I do feel that way about this movie. I know this is going to sound ludicrously pretentious, but I actually quite like being pretentious, as you probably realise. And the thing is that, for me, this is film as prayer. It is an object of faith. It's about three guys, set in the near future, and there's this zone has been created. It's actually based on a science fiction novel by the Strugatsky brothers, and it's much more specific in the book, that this alien craft has landed and created a zone around it. But this is not actually specifically outlined in the Tarkovsky film. It's much more spiritual and mysterious. So there's this zone, and if you go into the zone, there's a room, and in the room, if you go into the room, your most deepest wish will be fulfilled. And stalkers are people who can get you in, they're guides. And this scientist and this writer, they hire this stalker to get them in. And what effectively happens is this. For about 2.5 hours, you watch three grown men, wander around a dilapidated house in this kind of post-industrial zone, sort of talking about getting to this room. That's it. And really, it's very silly. They throw this thing to sort of see where they should be going. It marks out. Then they get into the house, and there's this long tunnel, and the man's creeping along the tunnel. And nothing's happening. Now, you could watch this film and think, what a stupid load of rubbish. But that's the point. Just as what they're doing is an act of faith, the whole film is an act of faith. You sit in a church and pray. You could argue that what you're doing is ludicrous, right? But if you believe in it, it's extraordinarily powerful. And this is Tarkovsky's cinema. If you buy into it, if you believe in it, it's an act of faith on your part, the rewards are extraordinary. I remember seeing this film at the Ciné Lumière in the French Centre in Kensington. I'd never seen Tarkovsky before. I remember there's a scene early on where, in sepia, this guy goes into this warehouse and he has to cross this pool to get to one of those trailers, those trailers you have in old Chaplin movies or Keaton movies which go up and down and it goes along the tracks. And I remember that on the big screen the pool looks like a sea. And it looks like he's wading across the sea. It was so incredible. It was beautiful. Suddenly, even the most simple tactile things had a mystical beauty about them. That's Tarkovsky's cinema. And it feels like that the whole way through. A waterfall feels extraordinary and strange. And at the end of the film, what I love so much about this film, and why it is a genuinely mystical and spiritual film, is the three men stop on the threshold of the room, afraid to go in, but the camera backs in. We go into the room. As I say, it's not a film for everyone. I recommended this to my brother and he was bored out of his mind. But I think if you're prepared to go with it, there's no greater experience in film. So those are the films that made me. Those are the films, not necessarily my 10 best films or anything like that, but the films that were the landmarks in my film going. I'd like to hear from you. What are the films that have made you, and what are the films that have most meant to you and given you an understanding of cinema? So please respond below and like and subscribe. Thank you very much.